Putin expected Ukraine to roll over in days when he launched the full-scale war in February 2022. But this was a tragic misreading of the Ukrainian people because they were prepared to fight for their independence and liberty. The Russian world concept did not have the attractions that Putin and his acolytes seemed to believe. Instead of a small victorious war, Russia has become entangled in a quagmire that has now claimed more Russian lives than 10 years of war in Afghanistan. As it looks ever more likely that Ukraine will emerge victorious, albeit paying a terrible price for that, Russia's future is far less certain. In this episode, we explore what language can tell us about the strategic miscalculations of the Russians, the declining impact of propaganda, and the resilience of Ukrainians. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce, and our material is now available on popular podcasting platforms as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Ksenia Turkova is a journalist and a linguist with a PhD in philology, language and literature. She has both Russian and Ukrainian backgrounds and has worked in both countries for private as well as independent media. Her specialist area of research is studying media texts and propaganda. Ksenia is a guest lecturer at American universities and runs a YouTube channel, which offers analysis of current events from the point of view of the nuances of language. Ksenia, thank you so much for joining me on the channel.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're going to talk a lot, aren't we, about the myths, the Russian propaganda myths, and the suppression of the Ukrainian language and culture, not just, in occupied territories now, but actually over decades or even centuries. But I'd love to learn a little bit more about your background.
I was born in the Moscow region, so it's a town not far from Moscow, very close actually. And I graduated Moscow University, and I became a journalist in early 2000s. I was an intern on one of the most popular, maybe the most popular TV channel that time. It was NTV channel. And every journalist that time was dreaming about the job. And I was so happy I got it through internship. I was a student. And then after I graduated Moscow University, I defended my thesis in media text analysis, and I analyzed actually TV language, Russian TV language, and of early 2000s. So if you read it, so you can see how actually propaganda was that propaganda started, because a lot of people think that propaganda started only with the start of this war. I mean, on a big scale, but actually it was a gradual process over the last 20 years. So I was a journalist for that NTV channel that was overtaken by the state oil company Gazprom in 2001. And then we started, our team started a new channel that was unfortunately closed in several months because of the censorship. And we started another channel which was also closed because of the censorship. Then I switched to radio, and I worked several years for Echo Moskvy, the most popular and influential news and talk radio station in Russia, which was recently shut down when the war started. And I worked for several TV channels and radio stations. At the same time, all this time I was teaching at the Moscow University, teaching Russian language. And language was always one of my main interests. And I wrote a lot about language, academical things, as well as some journalistic analysis. And after that, in 2013, I got a job offer from Ukraine. It was before the Revolution of Dignity. So they offered me to move to Ukraine only for 1 year to start a new radio station, news and talk radio station. And I was very happy to try it. It was very interesting to start a radio station from scratch. And when I moved there, in several months, the revolution began, Maidan. And I decided to stay first because I supported Ukraine. And second, I just loved what I was doing. I loved talking to people on radio. I was covering all the events in Ukraine. I was on air 4 hours every day for like 3 or 4 years, 3 years. And then I changed my job. I became an executive producer of one of the Ukrainian TV channels, and I was leading the Russian-speaking segment of that channel. And it was in 2016, 2017. And then I got a job offer from Voice of America, and I decided to move to United States.
And what was the name of the radio channel in Ukraine that you moved to work for?
The radio channel was called Vesti, and it has the same name as the Russian state TV channel. But in fact, it had nothing to do with the Russian channel. It was just a name, and it was a very popular radio station. People recognized the anchors on the streets, and it was probably one of my best periods in my career. So I loved that time, but unfortunately there was an ownership issue with this radio station. And I don't want to go into details because it will take too long. So the owners were related to the previous government, and a lot of them fled. They escaped Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity. That's why they couldn't tell us what to do. So we were free because our owners were not in Ukraine anymore. But the project has already started, and a lot of very good, high quality journalists were involved into it. But then it just came to the point when we couldn't continue just because of the ownership, and we understood that at some point the owners would be willing to go back to Ukraine and somehow influence the content of the radio station. So I just decided to quit at some point.
And from what you were describing earlier, I mean, one question jumps out, and I know it's not on the sort of topics we pre-agreed, but I've always been fascinated by the idea that you said a number of stations you worked for were closed down in Russia. And Gazprom, of course, played a significant role in taking over Gusinski's NTV and firing a lot of the independent voices. In fact, a lot of people actually fled the country at that point. Kisilov, the good Kisilov, not the bad one, obviously, and who is now in Ukraine. But it always fascinated me because, of course, Echo Moskvy was also majority owned by Gazprom, and yet that was only shut down last year. How did that manage to keep going when so many other channels were silenced?
The big percentage of the radio station belonged to the journalists. So maybe that played the main role in how the radio station survived. So it was not entirely Gazprom's radio station. Part of it, and a significant part belonged to journalists. And also, I think at that time, not now, Russian government and Putin himself, they want to shut down like every independent media, every resource. But before that, in my opinion, they paid attention only to the big TV channels, because television in Russia was always the most influential tool and that's why that TV channel Rain always had some problems. They tried to do something with this channel, and they always were paying attention to the big TV channels because it was the main instrument of how to affect people's minds on a big scale. That's why maybe radio station they didn't look at it as such an influential tool. And also Alexei Venediktov, the head of the radio station, he also played a big role in what made radio station keep going and surviving, because he was like a buffer between the team and the Russian government, and so there were some negotiations took place. I don't know because I don't know exactly, but his role in surviving, radio station surviving, was also I think significant. We can say like whether it was good or bad, but the fact is that I think he helped the radio station survive.
Well, let's turn to Ukraine, because I think one of the big things we're going to be talking about is the multilingual and multicultural identity of Ukraine. And that, of course, is getting stronger, but it is a mixed country with an incredibly complex past, isn't it? And of course, through big parts of history, there has been an effort to suppress the Ukrainian language and culture. Could you sort of broadly describe, how that's played out, and how that has in the past maybe divided the country?
So you're right. Ukrainian language was oppressed for years, decades, and centuries. And when I was preparing for our conversation, I found the timeline of repressions against Ukrainian language, and we can now like play a game. Can I ask you to pick the decade between 1627 and nowadays? Any decade.
1690s.
1690. Okay, 1696. The Polish Sejm of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth orders to implement the Polish language in courts and institutions of Ukrainian lands under Polish rule. So pick another one.
1720.
1720. Tsar Peter I orders to ban book printing in Ukrainian and to eliminate of Ukrainian texts from church scriptures. 1729, Russian Empire. Tsar Peter II orders to rewrite all government orders from Ukrainian into Russian. And let's pick something from the 19th century.
Let's go for 1870, emancipation of the serfs, crucial year.
1870. 1870, Russian Empire. Russian Minister of Education, Tolstoy, explains that the end goal of the education of all foreigners has to be Russification. And 1876, there was also the law, Ukaz of Alexander II, that prohibited printing and importing from outside the country any Ukrainian language literature, as well as the bans Ukrainian theatrical performances and printing of Ukrainian texts on sheet music, including national songs. So you can tell that you can pick any decade from 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century, and actually 21st century as well. And you will find some repression against some law, against Ukrainian language. So it's the long history of repression, and that language was always oppressed under some other language like Polish or Russian language, mostly Russian language. And in the Soviet era, Ukrainian language was considered as like a village language or something like that. Not only Ukrainian, actually all other languages, but specifically Ukrainian and Belarusian languages, because they are from the same group, they're Slavic languages. So in Russia, there was always that attitude that Ukrainian and Belarusian, they're like twisted Russian. And even I remember when I was in high school, middle high school, we were making jokes about, I am embarrassed to say that now, but I do remember those stories about funny Ukrainian words, and we were laughing. I mean, it was not like in a mean way, but still we were laughing about at some other language, and people were looking at it as some kind of twisted Russian, as I said, and that was the part of that colonial attitude to the other republics. I did a big project for that Ukrainian channel I worked for in Ukraine, Hromadske TV, and that project was dedicated to the situation with different national languages in the post-Soviet countries, and I was trying to find out how those languages were feeling and what was going on after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in each country, the situation is very different. But they all have something in common. That common thing is that the Russian language was dominating, and all other languages were considered as like second sort languages. So you couldn't have any career if you spoke only your native language, let's say Ukrainian or Armenian. I went to Armenia and they told me the same thing. So the Russian language was the key to your career, to your social lift, and that was that attitude Ukraine is fighting with now. They're trying to overcome this past. And actually in the whole world, we see that now that Ukrainian is getting more and more popular. And the situation in post-Soviet Ukraine with the language was complicated.
And you mentioned Belarus and the Belarusian language. That hasn't survived in quite the same way that Ukrainian has it? The Russification of that country was in some ways more severe and more damaging because far fewer Belarusians can actually speak, the language that's native to that territory.
Yes, in Belarus, they have a different situation with the language. I also went to Belarus to work on my project, to write about the situation with Belarusian language. I use the adjective Belarusian, not Belarusian, and I will explain why. Because I don't want people to think that Belarus is some kind of Russia, like Russia, Belarus. And I want to use the adjective that is created from the name Belarus, so like Belarusian, and I'm trying to stick to it because I think Belarusian is more like a Soviet version of the name for the language. So in Belarus, they have a difficult situation with the national language, and it's considered officially, it's officially admitted by the international organizations that Belarusian language is dying. Like officially, it's a dying language, and it was predominantly present in the village, outside the big cities in Belarus, and people kept it there. But at some point, the national movement for the language started in the 90s. And there are a lot of activists who are trying to use Belarusian language, who are trying to translate the movies into Belarusian language. But you asked me why the situation is different and the Ukrainian language is in much more favorable position. It's because of the referendum that happened in Belarus in 1995, when they gave the equal status to both to Belarusian and to Russian language. And the thing is that Russian language was already developed, so people used it a lot. And the Belarusian language, as I said, was staying mostly in the villages, or some activists were speaking Belarusian. It was rare, or some rare politicians. And so what happened when you have two languages and they are not in equal position, of course, people will choose the language they got used to, and that's why Belarusian language, being already oppressed and being already in that, being already not developed enough, they just buried it with this referendum, giving it the equal status with the Russian language. And that was a I maybe not a mistake, it was done intentionally, but that's what happened. And that's why in Ukraine they didn't want to do the same thing, because in Russia they in Russian propagandist media they talked a lot about it, about that law, language law, and that was one of the main narratives. Why they don't want to give that status, equal status to the Russian language as well as Ukrainian? That's why, because they didn't want the same thing that happened in Belarus. And that's the proof what can happen with the language. Of course, Ukrainian language was in a better position for many reasons, but still, if you want to develop your national language, if you want your language to stay strong, you need to have this language as an official one.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes sense. And of course, traveling around Russia quite a lot, as I did, back in the 90s and 2000s, you find that in many of the sort of Soviet countries, anyone who was in the administration, anyone who was in, say, the legal profession, Russian, as it were, is a sort of first language. I mean, very similar, of course, to what the British would have done in India. You would have had to speak the imperial language in order to, work in any position of power or generate wealth. And this sort of provincial or secondary status that was given to non-Russian languages, that was also extended to the literatures in those languages as well, wasn't it? They were allowed to exist only so far as they were sort of provincial or on a different tier of importance. And that was another way of suppressing identity, wasn't it?
Yes, I agree about the literature. And you know what? I will tell you my personal story. Recently, several months ago, like maybe 3 months ago, I joined the Ukrainian book club. I wanted to join it before, but I didn't have time, and I just have a lot of things to do, so I didn't have time for that. But when the war started, I thought, this is the time for me to join this Ukrainian reading club, book club. And so we read Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian classical literature, Ukrainian contemporary literature, or some, for example, world literature translated into Ukrainian, because not all books were translated into Ukrainian, and some of them are being translated only like now. And when I lived in Ukraine, I saw it, how the bookstores were flooded with the Ukrainian content, Ukrainian books. When I just moved to Ukraine in 2012, 2013, you go to I saw a completely different picture. You go to the bookstore and you see a lot of fiction literature in Russian. Of course, there were a lot of books in Ukrainian, like for kids or school books, some school books, but fiction literature for adults were predominantly Russian. That was actually strange, but people didn't see that situation as a strange situation. And when the Revolution of Dignity happened, things started changing. The little publishing houses all around the country and the big ones, they started working harder, and they started publishing more books in Ukrainian. They started collaborating like with each other and with different Ukrainian writers, and a lot of new writers appeared in Ukraine. And today, by the way, there is a very famous Ukrainian Russian-speaking writer, Andrei Kurkov, and his novel was today, I read in the news that it was named as one of the books of the year by the New Yorker magazine. So now people start seeing Ukrainian literature. And so in this book club, I started reading Ukrainian literature. And when I just joined it, I started with, they were reading some classical books. I think it was like two classical books in a row. And when I was reading them, listening to them, like audio versions, I was listening and I was thinking, but it's not like worse than Chekhov, for example. Why do we see Chekhov or Pushkin or Tolstoy as like something outstanding in literature, and why don't we see like Kotzebinski, reading Kotzebinski as someone equal? And we've never talked about it in those terms, because we didn't know anything about the literature of other post-Soviet countries, and then Soviet Union. Everybody was reading classical Russian literature, and so I was reading, and my eyes were opening. So I was thinking, like, why just a second. So I was reading, and my eyes were kind of opening, and now I read a lot of Ukrainian books, and I just enjoy it in Ukrainian, of course, and we discuss it, and I realize that I didn't know anything about that. And I think it's very important that now the world is finally finding out the treasures of Ukrainian literature.
And that's an interesting process, isn't it? Because, you know, when I studied Russian, and many of the journalists and people I've been speaking to, you know, over the last, well, I mean, probably forever, ever since journalists started going and reporting, they'd go to Moscow. And even if they were going to report on Ukrainian affairs, they'd usually be doing it while based out of Moscow. And of course, they'd have, you know, friends, acquaintances, colleagues, and everything gets filtered, doesn't it, through a lens, whether consciously or unconsciously. You look at the world through the eyes of, you know, I'll say it, the imperialist power. And it does cloud your judgment, not just about Ukraine, but about many territories and countries in the former Soviet Union. Do you think that's going to change now?
Yes, that's true. We were all looking at the events through that optic. You used a very accurate expression. You put it in a very good way. So yes, we looked through the empire optic at the events in different post-Soviet countries. Even the names, for example, the names of the Ukrainian cities before the war, a lot of English speaking media, they would use the Russian versions of the names, like Kharkov, Lvov, or Zaporozhye. But now we see only Ukrainian versions of those words, of those toponyms. Kharkiv, Lviv, Zaporizhia, and if you think about it, it's actually not logical at all. Why would you use the Russian versions of the Ukrainian cities? But we were using it all the time, and only now we changed it to the actually Ukrainian versions. If you think about it, it's a weird situation. It used to be a weird situation, and yes, now it's changing finally. Now we'll look at the events through Ukrainian eyes, and I think it will help to understand better other countries, not only Ukraine, because the language situation is changing. And I noticed that here I live in Washington, D.C., and before the war, we had like kids camps for kids only in Russian. Camps for the Russian-speaking families, for those who came from different post-Soviet countries. But some of them, they speak their own languages, like Kazakh language, for example, is very popular, or Ukrainian language, or Romanian, who came from Moldova, and so on. But we had only camps in the Russian language. But this summer, the situation changed, and we had camps in Ukrainian language, and I saw the announcement about the camp in Kazakh language, which never happened before. I haven't seen it. I have never seen it. And I think it's a very significant sign of a very significant shift in maybe in the Western society, in how they see the other countries. And also it's a shift in our post-Soviet mentality, in the mentality of post-Soviet people, because they finally find their identity, and they understand who they are. They understand that they are not post-Soviet people, Russian-speaking people. They understand, okay, I am Ukrainian, I am from Moldova, or I am from Kazakhstan. They understand better their identity now. I think so. It's just my observation.
And it's an irony, isn't it? Because Putin has accelerated that process through his aggression, brutality.
Absolutely.
I mean, it would have happened far slower potentially. And, one of those big effects, isn't it, is the tearing down of Soviet monuments. And I know there is debate in the West about, how to treat monuments, associated with slavery and all the rest. I think that's different, because monuments in the West that have connotations to slavery, very few, if any, people would want to resurrect that institution. They might argue that the statue should change, but no one is, that's not an active political debate, and no one holds that point of view. Yes, racism exists, but no one is advocating for the return of slavery. But the destruction of Soviet-era monuments, that feels much more live, doesn't it? Because they represent an occupation. They represent an imperial tendency, which is still part of official government policy. So they're not just sort of dead monuments from the past. They're living representations of a country which still has
of course, yes, because
ambitions.
it's painful to see them. For a lot of people, it's painful to see those monuments, because there are a lot of people who were repressed during Soviet era. And for example, for Crimean Tatars, I think associations with Soviet era, and especially with Stalin, because in Russia they glamorize Stalin, and while in Ukraine they're getting rid of the Soviet monuments, in Russia they put the monuments of Stalin. And now, as far as I remember, there are 150 monuments or more for Stalin all over Russia. And so they keep doing it. And for example, in Crimean Tatar, the popularity that was accused in the collaboration with Nazis, and the whole nation was repressed and sent to different locations far away from their home. for them, of course, that Soviet past is very painful.
And that's an interesting topic because, of course, even now when you listen to Western commentators, they say, well, Ukraine is taking back territories that are rightfully theirs and resetting to the position as it was in 2014. There's almost still an assumption in the West that Crimea somehow is Russian, that somehow that is less valid to take back than, say, Kherson. But I think it's a bit of a myth, isn't it? I mean, we don't know what people in Crimea think necessarily. There can be no
of course,
real
especially
social
now,
research.
it's very hard to say what people think now, because a lot of people are afraid of saying anything on the territories that are under Russia's control. But Crimea was always a very specific region of Ukraine, that is true. But there were always a lot of pro-Ukrainian people there. First of all, Crimean Tatars. They were always independent and pro-Ukrainian, and they are done with Russian Empire and Soviet Union, and they don't want to be under Russia's influence, because Russia was oppressed them and persecuted them from 18th century, actually, from Ekaterina the Great. They were oppressed from that time. And Crimean Tatars were actually one of the first activists who went on the streets before the annexation of Crimea, and after the annexation of Crimea, they went on the streets to show their position and to express their pro-Ukrainian position. And Crimean Tatars have helped, I think, shape Ukraine's sense of self, multi-ethnic and multi-confessional and multilingual place, because they speak Crimean Tatar, and by the way, the language was also oppressed in different periods of time, because they made them to switch from Arabic to Latin, and then from Latin to Cyrillic letters, Kirillitsa, and so in Crimea, among Crimean Tatars, you can find people, old people who had to switch to different alphabet 2 times in their life. So first, because they first were forced to switch from Arabic to Latin, and they learned it, and then in 30s they were forced to switch to Cyrillic. And when there was a wave of Russification, and so that you can find the person who had to switch 2 times, and it's difficult. So Crimean Tatars were a very strong part of Ukrainian society that were always against that Russian oppression, and they didn't want to be in Russia. And also there were a lot of different other activists, and pro-Ukrainian moods in Crimea were pretty strong, although there were, of course, pro-Russian people in Crimea, and maybe it was because Ukraine, they didn't pay much attention, as actually other countries, other post-Soviet countries. They didn't pay much attention to how influential Russian propaganda was. They told me the same thing, for example, in Estonia. They launched Russian-speaking channel only after the annexation of Crimea, because they realized that there is a pro-Russian part of the society in Estonia, and they are still watching Russian TV and all those propaganda talk shows and Solovyov and Kiselyov, and they are under the influence. And so they launched that Russian-speaking TV channel only in 2014. And in Ukraine, till the last moment, they also didn't pay much attention to that strong role of Russian propaganda, which is well done technologically and professionally. I mean, from the technology and point of view of how they make it on TV, and so they didn't see it as a threat, and so they didn't do anything with that, and they started doing something about Russian propaganda only after the Revolution of Dignity and after the annexation of Crimea.
And I think we in the West almost certainly underestimate the effectiveness of Russian propaganda. When we see various memes and clips shared, usually it's to sort of poke fun at it and to suggest that it's sort of primitive and laughable. And yet, when, I watch the news, you see a lot of Russian propaganda narratives, historical myths and tropes almost unconsciously appearing through sometimes fairly sort of sloppy and unconscious journalism. At other times, of course, you'll have activists on the hard left and the hard right who are actively using and weaponizing those narratives that come out of the Russian system. Do you think we need to get more serious about tackling Russian propaganda, the techniques and the narratives?
I think actually Western countries are getting already more serious about that. But you are right that in the Western countries, people are very, very, I would say, naive in a good way, because they are used to a high standard journalism. And you probably know a famous Russian-British journalist, Masha Slonim, and she lives in Great Britain. And I remember she told me, I had an interview with her, and she told me that we talked about Russia Today TV channel, and she said that, in Great Britain, the audience is very naive because people are spoiled with high quality news content. So they don't even assume that the journalist can lie. And they say, well, they just giving us like different point of view, and it's normal. We shouldn't shut it down, or we shouldn't consider banning some propagandist channels because we don't see it as propaganda. They're just giving us a different point of view. Well, we don't think that way. We disagree, but you need to have some pluralism and different opinions. And I think that what was happening in the most Western countries, because people were spoiled with good content. Because in the post-Soviet countries, although people believe propaganda in Russia, for example, but at the same time, it's a very interesting phenomenon. There is a picture, I can send it to you later. It's like a meme, picture meme. A man is sitting in front of TV, Russian guy sitting in front of TV and saying, I know you are lying, but I believe you. So the Russian audience, the people are always aware that journalists can lie. Everybody is lying. Officials are lying, journalists are lying, but at the same time, they are ready to be tricked. They know it can happen, so they are always on a high alert. But at the same time, they believe in that propaganda. That is a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know how people combine it, those qualities in their heads, but it's interesting. But I think now, with the help of Ukraine and Ukraine's messages to the Western countries, people started understand better the narratives of Russian propaganda and how sometimes they might be hidden. They might be covered with some beautiful words, and they understand it better, and they understand better the threat that goes from Russian propaganda.
And of course, a lot of that propaganda uses social media platforms. It seeks to sort of weaponize them and has actually used them remarkably effectively. And we seem to have, not that much defense against them. But I think what you said about Ukraine is fascinating because, of course, it has a very strong tech industry, and that has grown incredibly rapidly since 2014. And through the interviews I've done, I've now got the impression that Ukraine is at the forefront, not just of developing techniques to counter propaganda, but also at the forefront of media literacy, training the population en masse to think critically about news sources, as well as developing various technologies and techniques to try and identify, fake news from genuine.
Yeah, there are a lot of resources now in Ukraine, and they have very good media journalists, media specialists who write about media and who analyze the content, and they're very self-critical. There is a website called Detector Media. It's a watchdog of Ukrainian TV, and they do a lot of analysis of Ukrainian media, of Ukrainian TV specifically, and I read them quite often, and I noticed I knew that about Ukrainian people, so it was not a surprise. They are very self-critical, so they can, during the war, even during the war, they can criticize themselves for doing some wrong things in the media field environment. So, for example, they analyzed that national marathon. They have a TV marathon. So all the channels united, and now they have like a one channel on which different channels are represented on the certain TV on the certain time slots, but it's like the one broadcasting. They united for that TV marathon from the beginning of the war. Different channels belong to different people, because in Ukraine they had this problem with oligarchization. Because different oligarchs had different channels, but now they are united. And so the analysts were watching the TV marathon, and they noticed some things that they criticized in that analysis I read. So, for example, they counted time-wise how much time was dedicated to the representatives of different political parties. And of course, they found out that the Zelensky's party was represented more. And they pointed out that, you see, it's not equal. We don't have equal positions for different political parties. They're not represented equally on TV. And also I talked with some of them, with those media analysts, and they say that of course, on the one hand, it's good that they have this united broadcasting, but at the same time, it might be a threat to the freedom of speech after the war, because it's controlled by government now during the war. And we know that the war is already almost 9 months, and people can get used to it, to one position, because before they have a variety of different channels and positions, and people can get used to it, and that is something that they need to keep in mind after the war ends. After the war ends, so they should think about it, and how to prevent that influence of the government on the TV content. So they are discussing it all the time, how they can do things better, and they are being self-critical, which I've never seen in Russia. I can't imagine an article in Russia analyzing the content of main TV channels and criticizing this or that channel for not giving a word to both sides or something like that. It's something fantastic for me. But in Ukraine, it's a very common practice.
And that's an interesting sort of loop back, because I know we're coming towards the sort of end, and I've still got a million questions, so I think we'll have to probably have another session at some point. But it ties very interestingly back to what you were talking about in the early 2000s and with NTV, because We know that in the sort of informational autocracy that Russia was until the war started, when all the alternative voices were sort of snuffed out, a certain level of criticism was tolerated, but there were certain no-go areas, weren't there? So you could talk about certain things, criticize certain things, but certain people, certain institutions were untouchable. And of course, when NTV was shut down, one of the first things that was closed off was political satire, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, that's a puppet show.
Kukla,
Yes,
Viktor
Kukla.
Shenderovich, which I used to
Yes.
watch in Russia, yeah. But all forms of political satire were one of the first things to be repressed by Putin in the very early 2000s. And I think that's very telling, isn't it? If a society or a government can't tolerate satire, it tells you something about their true intentions.
Yes, of course. And in the early 2000s, I was very young. I was 20 years old. And at that time already, I understood the situation. I understood the threat of Putin's regime, potential threat. Because although the situation with media was more or less okay, at the same time, we as journalists, we felt that threat. We felt that that area of freedom of speech is shrinking. And I like to compare it, and I did it a lot of times, so maybe you heard it you heard it before, but I like to compare it to the high school contest called Dancing on the Newspaper, when the couples are dancing on the whole newspaper, then you fold it and you dance on the half of a newspaper, then on the quarters, and on 1/8, and so on, and until people start like just falling down. And the the winning couple is that couple that still keeps dancing. And that's what was happening with the free media in Russia, because we those who wanted to work for independent media, those who wanted to stay independent, they had to find those little islands of where we can dance on. But at some point they disappear. At some point you try to find one channel, it's shut down, another channel is shut down, and it's like less and less and less, and at some point you find out that you just can't work at all. And that's what happened after the war started.
Well, I think this might have to be the last question, but I think it's a good place to end. And you've talked about the sort of diversity of Ukrainian culture, the fact that it's probably more vibrant than it's ever been, and the publishing revolution that started to translate a lot of works internationally. What do you see as the future evolution of Ukrainian culture? And adversely, we see repression in Russia, the fact that many in the middle class have been fleeing and leaving. I mean, those who would naturally be the consumers of innovative culture. Do we see the two countries on a different trajectory, one getting stronger and evolving, and Russian culture in some way getting weaker and more repetitive and less innovative?
I think Ukraine is going to the future. So Ukraine's destination is the future, and Russia's destination is the past. And we talked already about glamorization of Stalin era, and they glamorize the era of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. So all they take all they get all the inspiration from the past. They don't get inspiration from the future, from some plans for the country. And even if when they explain some events, for example, how they explained that retreat, Kherson retreat, they explained it with the help of the propaganda of 18th century, of 1709, when they said that Peter the Great, well, everything is according to the plan. we have to retreat. Well, they don't say the word retreat, they call it maneuver. So we have to do this maneuver because you remember Peter the Great, he did the same with Poltava and he won the war. So they explain current events with the events that happened 300 years ago. And we see that Russia's head is turned to the past, and Ukraine is going to the future. And I think Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian language has a great future. I just talked to Duolingo scientist, Duolingo representative, and I made a piece for Voice of America about the popularity of Ukrainian language. And they say since the war started, the popularity of Ukrainian language stays stable. So it jumped from the bottom of the list of languages to like 10th or 15th position, and it stays there. So people keep learning Ukrainian. People watch Ukrainian movies. People start reading Ukrainian books and know more about Ukrainian writers. Yes, I think Ukrainian culture in general has a big future.
And even those parts in the east, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and others, and Mariupol, I've met a lot of people now from those areas. And of course, Russian is their primary language, but almost everyone I've met has a working knowledge of Ukrainian. They'll be able to read it and understand it and watch the television in that language, even if they're not necessarily fluent in speaking it. But there's a big move now, isn't there? For people,
yes, a lot of people are switching to Ukrainian. There was a big wave after the Revolution of Dignity already, but now they have even the bigger wave of switching into Ukrainian, and a lot of people who consider themselves as Russian speaking, they say now that they are Ukrainian speaking. They switch to Ukrainian and they never got back to Russian. I mean, they still can use it, but they use Ukrainian in their everyday communication predominantly. But for the whole world, I'm not talking about Ukraine itself. I'm talking about the whole world. The interest to Ukrainian language and culture is huge now, and I think it's not just situational interest. It will stay I think it will stay stable because Ukrainian culture is very interesting, and Ukrainian cuisine is delicious.
And humor
so
as well.
I think it will stay stable.
And Ukrainian humor, people are becoming acquainted with it for the first time. Very sometimes dark humor, especially in the sort of memes and the stoicism and the resilience people are showing. I think that Ukrainian identity is coming out of the shadows and coming onto the world stage in a way it's never done before.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's a great place to end. That's probably the most positive ending of any of the videos I've done this year so far. And it's good to look forward to something positive in what is obviously a very difficult time. Ksenia, I'm hugely grateful to you for spending time. I know it's very late where we both are now, but it's been hugely enjoyable.
Thank you so much for having me.